Young billionaire leaves the hospital in tears, until a mysterious street girl offers a way to save his wife. The lingering scent of antiseptic clung to Ethan Hayes' expensive suit as he checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He straightened his silk tie, though it didn't make him feel any more in control. The stark white hospital corridor had become a second home after months of waiting and hoping. Mr. Hayes, a weary-looking doctor in a white coat, approached him, dark circles under her eyes betraying long shifts. "Can we speak about your wife's condition?" Ethan nodded, preparing himself for yet another grim update on CLA's coma. "There haven't been any significant changes," the doctor said, flipping through the chart. "Her vital signs are stable, but brain activity remains minimal." "What about the new treatment I suggested?" Ethan pressed. "That specialist from Switzerland?" The doctor sighed, her tone gentle but firm. "Mr. Hayes, we've been over this. Even the most advanced experimental treatments show no promising results for cases like your wife's." A tight knot formed in Ethan's chest. He wasn't used to hearing no. In his world, everything had a price. He just had to find out what it was. "How much?" he asked abruptly. The doctor frowned. "I'm sorry. How much would it cost to bring him in? I'll pay double, triple if necessary." She shook her head. "It's not a matter of money, Mr. Hayes." For the first time in his life, Ethan Hayes faced a problem his wealth couldn't fix. He entered CLA's room, his gaze settling on her still form. The woman who once lit up every room now lay motionless, her face calm, almost peaceful. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was the only sign that life still remained in her body. Ethan sank into the chair beside her bed and took her cold hand in his. For 3 months, he had followed the same routine: walk in, sit down, hold her hand, talk about business, and leave. A schedule, a ritual. But today, something felt different. "The doctors aren't hopeful," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "They say there's nothing more they can do." He paused, struggling to find the right words. In boardrooms, words came easily to him. But here in this room, in front of CLA, he was lost. "I'm tired, CLA." A knock on the door broke the silence. A nurse entered. "Mr. Hayes, I need to check her vitals." Ethan stood. "Of course." As he reached for his coat, the nurse hesitated. "Are you leaving already?" "Yes, I have an important meeting." The excuse rolled off his tongue automatically, but for the first time since the accident, he left the hospital without any intention of returning. The elevator ride down felt heavier than usual, the weight of failure pressing down on him. He had always been in control, always able to buy his way out of problems. But not this time. CLA was slipping through his fingers, and no amount of money could bring her back. Stepping outside, he inhaled the cool night air. A light drizzle fell, the city lights reflecting in the puddles across the parking lot. He loosened his tie, feeling suffocated, not just by the fabric, but by everything. His life, his empire, his wealth. What did any of it mean without her? "Sir." The voice was small, barely noticeable amid the hum of the city. Ethan looked down. A little girl stood in front of him, no older than 5. She wore clothes far too big for her thin frame, her bare feet caked in mud. "Sir," she repeated, tugging lightly at his coat sleeve. His first instinct was to pull away. He had lived in a city long enough to know how to ignore beggars. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his wallet, ready to hand her some cash and move on. "I don't need money," she said, as if reading his mind. Ethan hesitated. "What? I know how to save your wife." His hand froze, wallet halfway out of his pocket. "My wife," he echoed, stunned. "The one who's asleep in there," the girl said, nodding toward the hospital. "I know how to wake her up." Ethan stiffened, glancing around, suspicion creeping in. Was this a scam? Someone taking advantage of his desperation? The girl smiled, a strange, knowing smile, one that didn't belong on a child who had seen hardship. "She has a beautiful smile," the girl said softly. "It starts on the right corner and then spreads, like she's about to tell a secret." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, because that was exactly how CLA smiled, and there was no way this girl could have known that. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. That smile, He had seen it before. It was exactly like CLA's. He had always noticed it, been captivated by it, but never shared that detail with anyone. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Lily," the girl answered, extending her small, dirt-covered hand for a handshake. The gesture seemed oddly formal, especially given her tiny frame. "And I can help you, if you trust me." Ethan looked at her outstretched hand. On any other day, he would have walked away without a second thought. But today wasn't just any day. Today was the day he had lost CLA, the day he had failed. "I'm Ethan," he said, shaking Lily's tiny hand. As their hands met, the air around them seemed to shift, as if the universe itself had paused, witnessing the beginning of something neither of them could predict. "You need to come with me," Lily said, gently tugging on his coat sleeve. "Please." Ethan glanced at the barefoot girl, then at his car parked a few steps away, then back at the hospital behind him. The light drizzle was turning into steady rain. "Look, I can take you to a shelter or call social services," he offered, feeling uncertain. "It's getting late and—" "No." Lily recoiled as if she had been shocked. "No social services. They'll send me back." "Back where?" he asked. "To the place I'm going to show you," she replied. "You'll understand when we get there. It's about your wife." Ethan hesitated. A part of him wanted to get in his car, go home, have a drink, and forget this day ever happened. But another part, the part that wasn't ready to let go of CLA, wanted to believe this strange child who somehow knew things she shouldn't. "And if I don't go?" he asked. Lily shrugged, a gesture that seemed too mature for someone so young. "Then your wife will keep sleeping." Ethan exhaled deeply. "All right, we'll go. By car." "No," Lily insisted. "We have to walk." "Walk? But it's raining, and you're barefoot." "I'm used to it," she said simply. "This way." Before he could argue, she had already started walking. Ethan looked up at the dark sky, feeling the cold rain on his face, and followed her. They left the bright hospital area and entered unfamiliar streets. Tall buildings gave way to smaller houses, which soon turned into rundown structures. The scent of cheap food and uncollected trash filled the air. "Do you live around here?" Ethan asked, carefully avoiding puddles. "I live everywhere," Lily said. "And nowhere." As they continued, Ethan felt eyes on them from the shadows. His expensive suit and polished Italian shoes marked him as an outsider. Instinctively, he reached for his wallet. "No one's going to rob you," Lily said, noticing the movement. "Not when they see me with you. They know you. Everybody knows everybody here." After about 20 minutes, they stopped in front of a large Victorian building. It had once been grand, but now broken windows and graffiti covered its walls. A rusted iron gate stood ajar. A faded sign above it read, "St. Hope Orphanage." "This is it," Lily announced. "An abandoned orphanage?" Ethan asked. "What does this have to do with CLA?" Lily didn't answer. She simply pushed open the gate and stepped inside. Ethan, now drenched from the rain, hesitated before following her. Inside, the building was a strange mix of decay and life. Cracked walls and broken floors contrasted with children's drawings taped here and there. Some rooms still had furniture, as if the place had been left in a hurry. "Does anyone still live here?" Ethan asked, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Just ghosts," Lily said. "And me. Sometimes." She led him into what had once been a recreation room. A mural covered one wall, filled with children's drawings and magazine clippings. Lily pointed at one particular drawing. That one was hers. Ethan stepped closer. It was a simple drawing, a smiling sun, a green field, and 3 stick figures, a man, a woman, and a child. In the lower corner, unmistakable handwriting read, "With love, CLA." "My wife," Ethan murmured, running his fingers over the paper. "She was here twice a week," said a voice behind him. "For almost a year." Ethan turned to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway. Her gray hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she leaned on a cane. "Mrs. Martha." Lily ran to hug the woman. "Lily, my angel," the woman said, stroking the girl's wet hair. "You disappeared again." "I brought Mr. Hayes," Lily explained. pointing at Ethan. He's CLA's husband. Mrs. Martha looked him over. So, you're the famous Ethan Hayes. CLA talked about you a lot. Who are you? Ethan asked, confused. And how do you know my wife? I ran this orphanage for 30 years, she said, until the funding ran out, and we had to shut down. CLA showed up one day, wanting to volunteer. She said she needed something meaningful in her life. Ethan felt like he had been punched in the gut. CLA had never mentioned an orphanage, never mentioned volunteer work, never mentioned children. She never told me about this, he whispered. She tried, Mrs. Martha said gently. Many times. She invited you to come, but you were always busy. One day, she even brought a picture of you to show the kids. Lily memorized your face. Ethan watched as Lily rummaged through a box of broken toys in the corner of the room. He couldn't understand why she hadn't told him how much this place meant to her. Mrs. Martha sighed. CLA believed you'd figure it out on your own when you were ready to see beyond your own world. They walked to a small kitchen in the back of the building, where Mrs. Martha still kept a few supplies. While she prepared tea, Lily sat next to Ethan at an old wooden table, its surface worn down by time. I was born here, Lily said suddenly. Or at least, someone left me here when I was a baby. I never knew my parents. She was found at the door wrapped in a blue blanket, Mrs. Martha added as she placed tea and chipped mugs before them. No note, no clue who left her. Mrs. Martha took care of me, Lily continued. She took care of all of us. We were a family. What happened to the other children? Ethan asked. When the orphanage closed, they were placed in different institutions, Mrs. Martha said as she slowly sat down. I try to keep in touch, but, well, bureaucracy isn't kind to the old and poor. And Lily? Ethan asked. She was assigned to a temporary home, but she ran away the night before the transfer, Mrs. Martha explained. I was hospitalized soon after due to a stroke and was gone for weeks. By the time I returned, Lily had disappeared. I didn't want to go, Lily admitted with a shrug. I didn't want to be taken away from the only family I had. Mrs. Martha sighed. Right after that, I had another stroke. I was in the hospital for weeks. When I came back, Lily was long gone. Since then, I've come here every day, hoping to find her. Ethan looked at the young girl sitting across from him. So small, so fragile, yet incredibly strong. She had survived on the streets, sleeping in abandoned buildings, running from the police and social services. Yet she still cared about a stranger in a coma. CLA came every week, Lily said, stirring her tea. She read to us, brought snacks, taught us to draw. When Mrs. Martha got sick, she cried a lot. That was the last time I saw her. The last time I saw her, Mrs. Martha echoed, her voice heavy. She promised she'd try to help. She said she'd convince her husband to do something. And then, I saw the accident on the news. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. CLA had tried to share this part of her life with him, and he had been too caught up in his own world to notice. I could have helped, he murmured. I could have done something. You still can, Lily said, gently touching his hand. That's why I brought you here, to show you the CLA I knew. She once told me you had a good heart, but you just needed to remember where you put it. Something inside Ethan broke at that moment. It wasn't just guilt or regret. It was the realization that he needed to protect this child, not just for CLA, but for himself. I'm going to help you, he said firmly. I'll do whatever it takes. Lily's face lit up with a smile, and for an instant, Ethan saw a resemblance to CLA, not in looks, but in the purity of her expression. And for the first time in months, he felt hope. By the time they stepped out of the orphanage, the rain had stopped. Mrs. Martha insisted that Lily stay with her, but the girl was determined. I need to help Mr. Ethan, she said with the stubbornness only a child could have. On the way back, Ethan called his driver. He couldn't let Lily walk barefoot through the wet streets. When the sleek black car pulled up to the curb, Lily hesitated. I've never ridden in a car like this before, she admitted. There's a first time for everything, Ethan replied, opening the door for her. Lily climbed in carefully, as if afraid she might break something. Her dirty feet stood out against the pristine leather seats, and Ethan noticed her trying to keep them off the floor. "You can relax," he told her. "It's just a car." "It's the nicest car I've ever seen," she said, still tense. That's when Ethan realized what was ordinary to him was extraordinary to her. Just like so many other things he had taken for granted. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. Ethan hesitated. His penthouse apartment didn't seem like the right place for a child who had been living on the streets. But he couldn't leave her behind. "Home, James," he finally answered. During the ride, he watched as Lily pressed her face against the window, mesmerized by the city lights. Every glowing sign, every towering building seemed to fill her with wonder. CLA would react like that whenever she saw something beautiful, Ethan murmured to himself. Lily turned to him. "She showed me a picture once," she said, "of the place you went on your honeymoon, a beach with really blue water." Ethan hesitated, staring at the soft, golden sand. He couldn't bring himself to take off his shoes and step onto the beach. A lump formed in his throat. That trip to the Maldives, Claire had begged him for those few days of rest, yet he had spent half the time glued to his phone, closing deals. "There's just too much sand," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'm not really a beach person." Mrs. Claire once told Lily that Ethan didn't dislike the beach. He just didn't know how to enjoy it. She said, "You're always in too much of a rush to notice the good things." Lily added. Her words hit him hard. So Claire had seen him that way. Someone incapable of appreciating the simple joys of life. They arrived at Ethan's building, one of the most exclusive in the city. The doorman's eyes widened at the sight of the ragged little girl by his side, but a single stern glance from Ethan silenced any questions. Inside the elevator, Lily was mesmerized by the glowing buttons. "Do people live on all these floors?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan replied, "but only one family per floor. Their apartments must be huge, bigger than the orphanage." "Some of them, maybe." She shook her head as if the idea was beyond comprehension. The moment they stepped into Ethan's apartment, Lily froze in awe. The space was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. The decor was sleek and modern, filled with designer furniture and contemporary artwork. "You live here all alone?" she asked, standing hesitantly at the entrance. "I do now," Ethan answered. "Claire and I used to live here together." Lily wandered through the apartment, taking in everything but never touching a thing. Then she stopped in front of a framed photo, Ethan and Claire on their wedding day. He looked as serious as ever in his pristine tuxedo, while she was glowing in a simple dress, her smile beginning at the right corner of her lips. Was she happy here? Lily asked, still staring at the picture. The question caught Ethan off guard. Had Claire been happy? He had always assumed so. He had given her everything money could buy. But after learning about the orphanage, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I think so," he said, though his voice lacked certainty. "At least at first." Lily turned to him with that knowing look far beyond her 5 years. "Mrs. Claire told me you once danced in the rain, the day you got engaged." Ethan blinked in surprise. "She told you that?" "She said it was the only time she ever saw you laugh, without caring about anything. No watch, no phone, just the two of you." The memory flooded back. An afternoon walk in the park that turned into a sprint for shelter when the rain came pouring down. Claire laughing, pulling him from under the awning, spinning with her arms wide open, daring him to join her. And he had, awkwardly, drenched, laughing like a fool. He had asked her to marry him right then and there, with raindrops clinging to her lashes and that irresistible smile on her face. "That was a long time ago," he murmured. "Did you forget how to dance in the rain?" The innocent question struck him silent. Yes, he had forgotten. He had forgotten so much. "We need to get you some clothes," he said, quickly changing the subject. "And a warm bath." Later, after a startled housekeeper provided fresh clothes and prepared a room for Lily, Ethan sat alone in the living room, an untouched drink in his hand. In the guest room, Lily slept soundly, exhausted after her first hot bath in weeks. Ethan picked up his phone and scrolled through old photos. There weren't many of him and Claire together. He had usually been the one behind the camera, or they had been at formal events, surrounded by other people. But one picture always caught his attention. Claire sitting on the windowsill of this very apartment, watching the rain. She hadn't known he was taking the photo. Her profile was calm, almost melancholic. What had she been thinking at that moment? Was she remembering their dance in the rain? Or was she wishing he was different? Ethan walked to the window and gazed out at the city. For years, this view had symbolized his success, each building a landmark of his achievements, each light proof of his empire. But for the first time, he felt small in its vastness, and alone. The days that followed brought an entirely new rhythm to Ethan's life. Lily woke up early and always found him already at work in his home office. He tried to maintain his usual routine, but her presence changed everything. On the morning of the third day, she watched him answer emails and asked, "Why do you work so much?" "It's what I do," he replied. "It's how I have all of this." "But you already have so many things," she said simply. "Why do you need more?" Ethan had no answer. He had never questioned his relentless drive. More money, more power, more success. It was all he had ever known. "Let's go out for a bit," he said, shutting his laptop. He was surprised to realize he couldn't remember the last time he had taken a break. Ethan took the morning off simply because he wanted to. He decided to take Lily to a department store and buy her some nice clothes. The little girl was overwhelmed by the endless choices. As she tried on colorful dresses, Ethan realized he was smiling, a real, genuine smile, something he hadn't done in months. "Do you like this one?" he asked as she stepped out of the dressing room wearing a blue dress. "It's too pretty for me," Lily said, running her hands over the soft fabric. "Nothing is too pretty for you," Ethan replied, surprised by the honesty in his own words. After their shopping trip, they took a stroll through the park. It was a weekday, and most people were at work. Normally, Ethan would have been in important meetings, making deals. But instead, he was watching Lily happily feeding the ducks at the pond. "Mrs. Claire liked coming here," Lily said as she tossed bits of bread to the eager ducks. "She did," Ethan confirmed. "Early in our relationship, we used to have picnics here." "Then you got too busy?" Lily asked innocently, though the question carried more meaning than she realized. Ethan sat down on a nearby bench. "I guess so. I was building my company, and Claire, well, I think she tried to keep up with my pace for a while. Until she found the orphanage, maybe." He looked up at the sky, partly cloudy, as if searching for answers. "I never really asked what drew her there. I always assumed her charity work was just a hobby." Lily joined him on the bench, her feet barely reaching the ground. She said helping people made her feel truly useful. She wanted more than just charity galas and magazine photos. Ethan felt the weight of those words. Claire had tried explaining this to him countless times, but he had never really listened. He always praised her efforts, but deep down, he saw them as nothing more than a socialite's pastime, not something serious. "She wanted children," he murmured, recalling an old conversation they had brushed aside. "I always said it wasn't the right time." Lily looked at him with her penetrating gaze. "When is the right time?" Ethan had no answer. He realized now that he hadn't postponed having children because of time or money, but because he was afraid. Afraid of not knowing how to be a father, of failing to balance work and family, of disappointing a child the way he had, without realizing it, disappointed Claire. "Let's get some ice cream," Lily suddenly suggested, jumping off the bench. "Now, before lunch. Why not?" Her grin was contagious. Mrs. Claire always said rules exist to be broken once in a while. For once, Ethan agreed. They walked to a small ice cream shop, where Lily ordered the biggest sundae on the menu. Ethan, sticking to habit, only got a coffee. "Aren't you going to have ice cream?" Lily asked, already sporting a chocolate-stained mouth. "I'm not much of a sweets person." "Never?" "Rarely." She pushed her sundae toward him. "Try it. It's the best ice cream in the world." Reluctantly, Ethan took a small spoonful. The rich, sweet flavor melted on his tongue, unlocking childhood memories, hot summer days, laughter, a time when life was simpler. When was the last time he allowed himself to enjoy something so small, without worrying about calories or meetings? "Good, isn't it?" Lily asked, her eyes shining. Ethan nodded. "It really is." They returned home in the late afternoon. For the first time ever, Ethan made Lily a snack in the kitchen. As he finished, his assistant called, reminding him about an important meeting he had missed. "You should have told me earlier," Ethan said, irritated. "Reschedule for next week." "But sir, it's about the acquisition." "I said reschedule." Ethan hung up, surprised at his own decision. When he walked into the living room with the sandwiches, he found Lily staring at a framed picture of him and Claire. "You both look different in this picture," she observed. "Different how?" "You look more serious. And Mrs. Claire, she looks less bright." Her observation caught Ethan off guard. In the picture, they were posing. He, the successful businessman, she, the perfect wife. Over time, those masks had become more real than their true selves. They sat at the kitchen table to eat, another small but unfamiliar experience for Ethan, who usually ate alone or in upscale restaurants with clients. "Are you going to visit Mrs. Claire today?" Lily asked between bites. Ethan froze. He hadn't returned to the hospital since the day he met Lily. A wave of guilt washed over him. "Yes," he said. "We're going to visit her." Lily's face lit up. "Can I come too?" "Of course. Didn't you say you knew how to help her?" Her smile brightened the entire room. That was when Ethan realized he had gone the entire day without thinking about work, checking the stock market, or making a single business call. And, surprisingly, he didn't feel anxious or restless. For the first time in years, he was simply living in the moment. And it was all because of a little orphan who had walked into his life like an unexpected angel, reminding him of the man he used to be, the man Claire had fallen in love with. As he watched Lily finish her snack, Ethan made a silent promise, to himself and to Claire. If there was even the smallest chance to bring his wife back, he would do things differently this time. He would start by appreciating the little moments, the ones that truly mattered. A month had passed since Ethan met Lily outside the hospital. A month filled with change, revelations, and pain. Claire remained in a coma, showing no signs of improvement. But something had changed, not in her, but in him. Standing in his office, Ethan stared out the window while his lawyers explained the details of his new project. He wasn't the same man anymore, the man who had once been obsessed with success at any cost. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every detail and asking questions he once would have brushed off as unimportant. Finally, he turned to his team and made his decision. "It's settled," he announced. "We'll buy the property next to St. Hope Orphanage and start construction immediately." One of the lawyers, Mr. Hayes, adjusted his glasses nervously. "I understand the urgency, but have you considered other locations? That area isn't exactly upscale." "That's exactly why it needs to be there," Ethan responded firmly. "The children are there. We're not going to build another charitable project in a wealthy neighborhood just for sponsors to take photos at galas." His determination left no room for debate. The lawyers exchanged uncertain glances, but knew better than to argue once Ethan Hayes had made up his mind. "The Claire Hayes Community Center will open in 6 months," Ethan continued. "Not a year, not 8 months, 6 months. I want a team working around the clock if needed." After everyone left, Ethan remained in his office, staring at a drawing Lily had made. 3 stick figures with the letters C, L, and A above them, symbolizing a family. This was no longer just a dream or a memory. It was a plan, a purpose. He had realized something important. His love for Claire couldn't just be expressed through hospital visits and regret. It had to become action, something real that continued her legacy. The intercom beeped, pulling him from his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes, Lily and Mrs. Martha are here," his secretary announced. "Send them in," he said, quickly putting the drawing away and straightening his tie. Lily ran into the room, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She was no longer the frightened, dirty child he had found weeks ago. Now, she wore a clean blue dress, and her hair was neatly pulled back into a ponytail. Mrs. Martha followed behind, moving slowly with her cane. "You said there was a surprise," Lily exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. Ethan smiled. "I do. But first, we need to pick up Claire." Lily's smile faltered slightly. Did she wake up?" Her voice was filled with fragile hope, squeezing Ethan's heart. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. But that doesn't mean she can't be with us. The hospital routine had become familiar. The head nurse, who had once looked at them with skepticism, now greeted them with warmth. They had become part of the scenery, as constant as the medical equipment itself. Inside the room, Claire remained still, her face peaceful as always. Ethan leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Hey, honey," he whispered. "I brought Lily and Mrs. Martha. We have a surprise for you." He pulled out a Polaroid camera and took a picture of Claire, then snapped photos of Lily, Mrs. Martha, and himself. "What are you doing?" Lily asked curiously. "You'll see," Ethan replied, tucking the photos away carefully. The car stopped in front of a large, vacant lot beside St. Hope Orphanage. A massive sign read, "Future site of the Claire Hayes Community Center, opening in 6 months." Architects and construction workers were already at work, surveying the site and preparing the ground. Lily peered out the window, her eyes wide. "What is this?" Ethan opened the car door and helped Mrs. Martha out. "Come see." They walked to a makeshift table covered in blueprints and models. Ethan knelt to meet Lily's gaze. "This will be a place for kids like you," he explained. "It'll have classrooms, a library, medical offices, and a big yard to play in. Kids can come after school to do activities, get help with homework, or just have a safe place to be." Lily's eyes darted over the blueprints, trying to take it all in. "And the best part," Ethan continued, "is that Mrs. Martha will be the director. She'll choose the staff and make sure everything runs smoothly." Mrs. Martha pressed a trembling hand to Ethan's arm. "I never thought I'd see something like this in my lifetime." Ethan smiled. "Claire would have insisted on it. There's no one better than you to continue what she started." He took the Polaroids from his pocket and placed them in a small metal box. "This is our time capsule," he explained to Lily. "We're going to bury it in the foundation, so Claire will always be part of this place." Lily studied the photos, and then the drawing Ethan had added to the box. "Will Mrs. Claire wake up one day to see this?" she asked softly. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. He wanted to tell her yes, to promise that Claire would wake up, but he had vowed not to hold on to illusions anymore. "I don't know, Lily," he admitted. "The doctors say the chances are small, but awake or not, Claire will be with us through everything we build here." He handed Lily a small shovel. "Want to help me bury our time capsule?" Together, they dug a small hole near where the center's main entrance would be. Lily placed the box inside carefully and then covered it with soil, her expression serious and determined. "When the building is finished," Ethan said, "we'll put up a plaque here that says Claire Hayes is present in every brick, every smile, and every child who walks through these doors." Lily looked at the mound of dirt, then at the empty lot, and finally at Ethan. Slowly, a smile spread across her face, not the cautious, hesitant smile she sometimes gave, but a real one, full of hope and belief. "It's like having a piece of her with us all the time, isn't it?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes, Lily, it is." Ethan nodded, unable to speak as emotion tightened his throat. In that moment, he realized this wasn't a goodbye. It was a new beginning. It was the continuation of the story Claire had started, a love story that went beyond hospital rooms, machines, and grim diagnoses. As he watched Lily run around the lot, imagining where the playground would be, a sense of peace settled over him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. His love for Claire hadn't faded. It had transformed into something even greater, something that could touch more lives than just his own. This was Claire's true legacy, not the sorrow of loss, but the joy of moving forward. Somehow, Ethan knew that wherever she was smiling. The hospital felt different now. The same white walls, the same sterile corridors, but Ethan saw them through new eyes. For weeks, this place had felt like an enemy, a prison keeping Claire away from him. But as he walked with Lily by his side, he realized the real prison had been the one he built himself, brick by brick, with his indifference and obsession with work. "I'm not authorized to let child in," said the nurse at the ICU reception, eyeing Lily with suspicion. "Family members only." "She is family," Ethan replied firmly. Something in his tone made the nurse hesitate. She glanced at the documents on her desk, then at them. "15 minutes," She finally relented. And don't touch the equipment. Lily clung tightly to Ethan's hand as they walked to Claire's room. Before entering, he knelt to her level. She's sleeping, he explained gently. There are a lot of machines helping her breathe and checking her heart. It might look scary. Lily nodded, her face serious. I know. I've seen sick people before. That simple statement, spoken so naturally, reminded Ethan of everything the child had been through in her short life. He felt ashamed of his own weakness. When they entered the room, the familiar weight of grief hit him. Claire lay motionless on the bed, surrounded by machines, the steady beeping of the heart monitor breaking the silence. But for the first time, he saw past the tragedy. He saw the woman he loved, not just a patient in a coma. Lily let go of his hand and approached the bed slowly, studying Claire's face. She's thinner, she observed softly. Ethan blinked in surprise. It was true. Claire had lost weight. He hadn't noticed, too consumed by his own pain. But Lily, who had only seen her a few times, had. Yes, he admitted, stepping closer. She is. Lily reached out and gently touched Claire's fingers. Her nails are different, too. She always had them painted in pretty colors. Another detail Ethan had overlooked. Claire loved painting her nails, always changing colors. He used to think it was trivial. Now her nails were bare, trimmed short by a practical nurse. Ethan sank into the chair beside the bed, the same chair he had occupied for months. He used to sit stiffly, talking to Claire as if in a business meeting, updating her on his day, sharing news, never really talking with her, just talking at her. What should I say? He asked Lily, suddenly unsure. She shrugged. What would you say if she could answer? The question caught him off guard. If Claire could respond, what would he say? It wouldn't be about stock reports or project deadlines. It wouldn't be about the outside world. Sensing his hesitation, Lily added, Mrs. Claire always talked about your smile. The real one. Not the one you show important people. Ethan took Claire's hand in his. It was cold, but not lifeless. Beneath her delicate skin, he could feel the faint pulse of her heart. Claire, he whispered. It's me. Ethan. Not the executive. Not the businessman. Just me. He paused, letting the words come not from his calculating mind, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere he had ignored for too long. I miss you, he continued, his voice breaking. Not just in our home or in our bed. I miss your gaze, the way you saw the world, the way you saw me. Lily sat quietly on the floor, hugging her knees, listening. I found out about the orphanage, Ethan went on. I met Mrs. Martha, and I met Lily. He glanced at the little girl. She's amazing, Claire. So strong, so wise for someone so small. Now I understand why you cared so much about her, about all those kids. Tears slid down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. He didn't need to hide anymore. You tried to show me what really mattered, and I didn't listen. I was too busy building an empire that means nothing without you. His voice faltered. He took a moment to steady himself. Lily stood and placed a small hand on his shoulder, a gesture of comfort beyond her years. Remember when we danced in the rain the day I proposed? Ethan whispered, a sad smile forming on his lips. I was drenched, my watch got ruined, and I didn't care. That was one of the happiest days of my life. And I don't know when I started letting moments like that slip away. He leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to Claire's forehead. I want to dance in the rain with you again, honey. I want to have all those picnics I postponed. I want to know the woman who found time to care for orphan children while I was too busy chasing money. Lily hesitated before asking, Can I tell her a story? Mrs. Claire always told us stories. Ethan nodded, wiping his tears. Lily climbed onto the bed and began telling a simple tale about a little bird who couldn't fly but found its courage when it had to save a friend. Her soft, childlike voice filled the room, carrying an innocence that contrasted with the weight of the moment. Ethan held Soleil's hand gently, stroking it as if he could somehow bring her back through touch alone. Something inside him had changed. Visiting the hospital was no longer a duty or a routine. It was an act of love, a chance to reconnect with a woman who had once chosen to share her life with him. When visiting hours ended and the nurse came to let him know, Ethan leaned down and whispered in CLA's ear, "I'll be back tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until you wake up. I promise to be a better man when that happens." And he kept that promise. In the days that followed, Ethan completely reorganized his life. He handed off responsibilities at work, canceled unnecessary meetings, and balanced his time between taking care of Lily and visiting CLA. Each visit, he brought something meaningful: a flower from their favorite park, an old photograph he'd stumbled upon, a song from the night they first met. More than anything, he spoke to CLA differently. He spoke with honesty, vulnerability, and presence. Lily was almost always with him. She had a way of talking to CLA, as if she were absolutely certain CLA could hear her. She chatted about her day, the new things she was learning, and how Ethan was teaching her to ride a bike. But after 2 weeks, nothing changed. The doctors remained doubtful, and the test showed no improvement. CLA remained motionless, her breathing supported by machines, her face peaceful, as if in deep sleep. On the morning of the 16th day, Ethan woke up feeling defeated. That night, he had dreamed of CLA. She was walking away from him, her back turned, and no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't reach her. The dream left a bitter feeling of failure. "Aren't we going to the hospital today?" Lily asked as she watched him make breakfast, not mentioning their usual visit. "I think we need a break," Ethan said, avoiding her eyes. "Maybe it's not working." Lily frowned. "What's not working?" "This, our visits. My conversations. Nothing is bringing CLA back." Her small face set with determination. "Are you giving up?" The question hit him hard. Was he, after all his promises, after finally realizing how much CLA meant to him? "I'm not giving up," he said weakly. "I'm just being realistic. The doctors say." "Doctors don't know everything," Lily interrupted, her voice firm. "Mrs. CLA wouldn't give up on you." Ethan set his coffee cup down, feeling the weight of her words. CLA had never given up on him. Even when he had been distant and cold, she had found ways to show her love, through the orphaned children she cared for, through small, quiet gestures he was only now beginning to appreciate. "I'll take you to the orphanage today," he said finally, "to see Mrs. Martha. You must miss her." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Are you going to leave me there?" The question shattered him. He hadn't even considered Lily's future. He had been so focused on CLA and his own transformation that he hadn't thought about what would happen next. Over the past few weeks, she had become part of his life, so naturally that he couldn't imagine it any other way. "No," Ethan said firmly. "I'm not leaving you there. I just thought you'd like to visit." Lily studied him, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. After a moment, she nodded. The orphanage looked even more worn down in the bright morning light. Broken windows, peeling paint. Everything spoke of neglect and abandonment. And yet, CLA had found beauty here. She had found purpose in the midst of ruin. Mrs. Martha greeted them with a tired smile. She looked frilier than she had just weeks before. "How is our CLA?" she asked, hugging Lily. Ethan lowered his eyes. "No change." Mrs. Martha nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "And you? Are you giving up?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Ethan wondered if his exhaustion was that obvious, if his face gave away his struggles so easily. "I don't know what else to do," he admitted. "I've talked to her, shared memories, brought her things that mean something, but nothing happens." Mrs. Martha gestured for him to sit at the same worn kitchen table where they had spoken before. Lily wandered off, searching for forgotten toys. "When I was young," Mrs. Martha began, "I loved a man who went off to war. For 3 years, I heard nothing from him. Everyone told me move on, that he was probably gone. But I felt here," she touched her chest, "that he would come back." Ethan listened intently. The day he returned, he was thin, tired, but alive. And he told me it was my love that had kept him breathing in his darkest moments. That even from miles away, he could feel that I hadn't given up. She took Ethan's hand, her own wrinkled and worn with time. "True love is never easy, Ethan. It's never convenient. It demands everything from us, especially when it seems impossible. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes. What if it's too late? What if I've already wasted too much time? It's never too late to love for real, Mrs. Martha said softly. CLA knows that. That's why she came here, because she believed in love, even in the hardest times. Ethan sat in silence, absorbing her words. CLA had found love in a place others saw as hopeless. She had seen beauty where others saw despair. Lily returned to the kitchen, holding a piece of paper. Look what I found. Mrs. CLA helped me make this. She held up a yellow drawing. Ethan took it carefully. 3 stick figures stood side by side, one with long hair in the middle, the other 2, one big and one small, on either side. Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent years running from love, avoiding emotions that felt too big to handle. But love had never abandoned him. Not through CLA, not through Lily. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to prove that he could be the man they both deserved. Holding hands with the figure in the middle, the words at the bottom of the drawing read in CLA's neat handwriting, "Family is where love is." When did she make this with you? Ethan asked, his voice unsteady. On the last day she came. Lily answered softly. She said she was going to bring you here and show you the orphanage. She said maybe we could be a real family. Ethan looked at the simple yet powerful drawing, then at Lily, and finally at Mrs. Martha. Suddenly, everything clicked. The accident had happened on the very day CLA was planning to open up to him, to show him this important part of her life, and to ask him to see beyond success and wealth. "I need to go back to the hospital," he said, standing up. When they stepped into CLA's hospital room, something felt different. Maybe it was the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, or maybe it was something inside Ethan that had shifted. He sat down in his usual chair, took CLA's hand, and gently placed Lily's drawing on the bedside table where she could see it if she opened her eyes. "I'm here again, honey," he whispered, "and I'm not giving up. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here waiting, because I finally understand what you always knew. Love is worth the wait. It's worth fighting for. It's worth everything." Lily moved closer and, without asking, carefully climbed onto the bed. She lay beside CLA, making sure not to disturb the tubes or wires, and rested her head on CLA's shoulder. Closing her eyes, she whispered, "We're here, Mrs. CLA. Your family is here." For the first time in months, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known before. Even if CLA never woke up, even if he had to live with the weight of his past mistakes, he now understood what she had tried to teach him all along. As he watched Lily and CLA, 2 souls so different, yet bonded by love that went beyond blood or circumstance, he realized he would never be the same. And maybe that was the true healing, not just for CLA, but for him too. Weeks passed, then months. Summer turned to fall, and the Claire Hayes Community Center started taking shape. The foundations were laid, and every day, the walls rose a little higher. Ethan visited the site almost daily, often with Lily in tow, making sure everything was just right. At the hospital, their routine continued. Ethan and Lily visited CLA regularly, sharing stories about the center's progress and their daily lives. The doctors had stopped offering pessimistic predictions and simply monitored her condition, adjusting treatments as needed. To them, Claire Hayes was a stable case, neither improving nor worsening, just lingering in deep sleep. One crisp October afternoon, the sky was a brilliant blue, without a cloud in sight. Ethan picked Lily up from school. He had managed to get her into a good private school, though the legal process for her custody was still in progress. "How was your day?" he asked as she climbed into the car, her backpack almost as big as she was. "Joy and I did a science project," she said excitedly. "We built a volcano that really erupts." Ethan chuckled. Lily had changed so much in the past few months. Once a scared, distrustful street kid, she had blossomed into a bright and curious child. She still had moments of fear, still woke up from nightmares, but she was healing. "Shall we visit CLA?" she asked, fastening her seatbelt. "Of course," Ethan said. "I have good news to tell her." On the way to the hospital, he told Lily about his meeting that morning. His company's board had unanimously approved the creation of a permanent foundation to manage the community center and expand its reach to other parts of the city. It was a long-term commitment, not just a one-time project. So other kids like me will have a place to go? Lily asked, eyes shining with hope. Exactly, Ethan confirmed. And we'll offer scholarships, medical help, and support for families who need it. At the hospital, the head nurse, Susan, greeted them warmly. Mr. Hayes, Lily, she said with a smile. Claire is waiting for you. It had become their little inside joke, talking about CLA as if she were conscious, as if she really were waiting. At first, some of the staff found it strange, but over time, they all adopted the same mindset. It was more comforting that way. CLA's room had changed over the months. It was no longer a cold, sterile space. Fresh flowers always filled the room. Lily's drawings covered the walls, and photos of the community center's progress were displayed. Ethan had even brought in a small radio to play CLA's favorite songs softly during the day. Hello, honey, Ethan said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. We have good news today. Lily climbed onto the chair beside the bed to be taller and took CLA's hand. Mrs. CLA, I got a perfect score on my spelling test, she said proudly. And my volcano was the best in class. Ethan smiled at their little routine, talking to CLA, sharing their achievements and thoughts, just as if she were there, listening. The initial pain and fear had faded, replaced by something gentler, acceptance, hope, and a new sense of normal. The foundation was approved, Ethan said, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding CLA's other hand. We're going to help so many kids, my love. Your work at the orphanage will reach even more lives than you imagined. As he spoke, he absently traced soft circles on her palm, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that had become second nature. Lily, still holding CLA's other hand, leaned in closer. You know what else, Mrs. CLA? Mr. Ethan doesn't work as much anymore. He eats dinner with me every night, and even learned how to make pasta. He's not very good yet, but he's getting better. Ethan laughed. Thanks for your confidence, kiddo. Lily sat up straight, her small face serious. Mrs. Martha says we should always tell the truth, she declared. She's right, Ethan agreed. Then, turning to CLA, he added, It's strange how much everything has changed, isn't it? I used to think I knew what really mattered, but I was completely wrong. I almost had to lose you to understand. His voice caught with emotion. Even after all these months, it still hurt to think of how blind he had been, how much time he had wasted chasing the wrong things. But he took a deep breath, steadying himself. We're building something beautiful now, he continued, his voice stronger, something that will last far beyond us. And it's all because of you, CLA. Your love for the kids at the orphanage, your ability to see potential where others only saw obstacles. Lily, who had slid off the chair, now sat on the bed, holding CLA's hand tightly. When you wake up, Mrs. Claire, you're going to love the center, she said with the unwavering certainty only a child could have. There's a music room, a huge library, and a playground with swings and slides. Mr. Ethan said we can put a fountain in the garden, just like the one we saw in the park. Ethan nodded. And we'll have a mural, stories of hope, he added. Stories of children who found their way, who overcame struggles, just like you, Lily. The little girl beamed, her smile growing brighter, something that had been happening more often in recent months. You know what I want most when the center is ready? She asked, looking at Claire as if expecting an answer. I want us to have a big picnic, like the ones we used to have before, with a checkered blanket, sandwiches, and lemonade. We'll do it, Ethan promised. And we'll invite all the kids and their families. It'll be a huge celebration. As they talked, they kept holding CLA's hands, one on each side of the bed, like a bridge between the past and the future, between what had been lost and what might still be reclaimed. The afternoon light shifted, the golden hues of autumn filtering through the window. That was when it happened, so subtle that Ethan almost missed it. A tiny movement, the faintest twitch of CLA's fingers against his. He froze, his heart pounding. Was it just his imagination playing a cruel trick? Mr. Ethan? Lily's voice was hesitant. Did you see that? So it wasn't just him. Lily had felt it too. Her hand. She moved her fingers. Lily whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Ethan's pulse raced. This wasn't the first time they had dared to hope. There had been false alarms before, small movements that the doctors had explained away as involuntary reflexes. Nothing meaningful. CLA. Ethan called softly, leaning closer. Can you hear me? Silence. Only the steady beeping of the monitors, and his own uneven breathing filled the room. Maybe we imagined it, he murmured, trying to temper his own expectations. But Lily shook her head stubbornly. No, we didn't. I felt it. She squeezed my hand, I'm sure of it. Ethan didn't want to crush her hope, but he also didn't want to nurture false expectations. They had been stuck in limbo for so long, neither fully despairing nor truly believing in a recovery. Let's call Nurse Susan, he suggested. She can check if there's any change in the vitals. But before he could press the call button, it happened again. This time, there was no doubt. CLA's fingers curled slightly around his. It was a deliberate movement. CLA. Ethan gasped, his voice breaking with emotion. You're there, aren't you? You can hear me. Lily jumped off the bed, her excitement bubbling over. I'm getting Nurse Susan, she exclaimed and dashed out of the room. Alone with CLA, Ethan leaned in so close that their faces were nearly touching. CLA, honey, if you can hear me, try to move your fingers again. Please. For an agonizing moment, nothing. Then slowly, CLA's fingers pressed against his once more. It wasn't a strong grip, but it was controlled. It was intentional. Tears streamed down Ethan's face. After all these months, after all the doubt and despair, that tiny movement meant everything. It was as if an invisible thread had pulled CLA back from the edge of oblivion. Susan rushed in, followed by Lily and a doctor, their expressions shifting from cautious skepticism to astonished hope. Ethan didn't realize she was responding at first. His voice trembled as he spoke. She can squeeze my hand. A doctor approached the bed, his badge identifying him as a neurologist. Mrs. Hayes, can you hear me? He asked gently. He took a small flashlight and checked CLA's pupils. His eyebrows lifted in surprise. There's a definite pupillary response, he noted. And look at the monitor. Her brain activity is increasing. Ethan barely registered the medical terminology. All that mattered was that tiny yet powerful connection between him and CLA. Proof that she was still there. Keep talking to her, the neurologist encouraged. Patients in a coma often regain hearing before other functions. Ethan leaned in closer, his tears dripping onto CLA's pillow. We're here, honey. Lily and we've been waiting for you. Take your time. We're not going anywhere. Lily carefully climbed onto the bed, making sure not to disturb the doctors. Mrs. CLA, we're building a special place for kids like me. Mr. Ethan says it's all because of you, because you cared about us. Please come back to see it. The neurologist continued his examination, checking her reflexes and monitoring her vitals. He shook his head in amazement. This is extraordinary, he murmured. I haven't seen many cases like this in my career. The next few hours passed in a blur. More doctors arrived. More tests were run. Ethan and Lily were briefly asked to step away, but they refused to leave the room. They stood together in the corner, arms wrapped around each other, watching, waiting, hoping for a miracle. Finally, the chief neurologist approached them, his expression cautiously optimistic. Mrs. Hayes is showing signs of emerging from the coma, he said. I can't promise anything. Recovery isn't always a straight path, but this is a very good sign. Ethan tightened his grip on Lily's hand. So what happens now? Now we wait, the doctor replied. We keep monitoring, stimulating, and talking to her. We'll see how she responds. When the doctors left, Ethan and Lily resumed their places on either side of CLA's bed. The room was calmer now, filled only with the soft hum of the radio and the steady beeping of the monitors. Do you think she'll wake up tomorrow? Lily asked, her voice small and hopeful. Ethan smiled gently. I don't know, sweetie. Like the doctor said, these things take time. But she took the first step, and that's what matters. They stayed by her side until the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, sharing stories, whispering their hopes and dreams. And then, as if it were a gift, they felt it, a faint squeeze of their fingers. That tiny, silent gesture was worth more than 1,000 words. Finally, Nurse Susan urged them to get some rest. Ethan leaned down and kissed CLA softly on the lips. "We'll be back tomorrow, honey," he promised. "And the next day, and the day after that, until you open your eyes and come back to us, no matter how long it takes." As they stepped out of the hospital, the night sky stretched above them, dotted with stars. "Miss Martha says when something good happens, it means the angels are smiling," Lily said, gazing upward in wonder. Ethan followed her gaze, his heart lighter than it had been in months. "I think she's right, Lily. Absolutely right." That night, for the first time in months, Ethan slept deeply. No nightmares, no anguish. In his dreams, CLA smiled at him, the same smile that always started at the right corner of her lips, as if she was about to share a secret. And maybe she was. Maybe the secret was that miracles don't always happen in grand gestures. Sometimes they happen in the smallest movements, in hands that reach for one another, in hearts that find their way back home. The waiting area of the Children's Services Department felt cold and impersonal. Uncomfortable plastic chairs, faded posters about child safety, a clock that seemed to move painfully slow. Ethan checked the time again. Only 5 minutes had passed. Beside him, CLA sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. On her other side, Lily swung her legs nervously, her feet barely touching the floor. "Is it going to take much longer?" Lily whispered, leaning toward Ethan. "I hope not," he replied, trying to sound reassuring. But the truth was, they had already been waiting for over an hour, and no one seemed to care. It had been 3 months since CLA awoke from her coma. Her recovery, though not complete, had amazed the doctors. The first few weeks were grueling. Intensive therapy, exhausting exercises, frustrating setbacks when her body didn't cooperate. But CLA faced it all with a determination that left Ethan in awe. Through every step of the journey, Lily was there. She held CLA's hand during the painful physical therapy sessions, memorized her speech exercises, and patiently practiced them with her. She brought light and laughter to the darkest days. The decision to adopt Lily felt natural. CLA was the first to bring it up one evening, while Ethan was helping her get ready for bed. "We need to talk about Lily," she said, her voice still slightly slurred from the after effects of the coma. "What about her?" Ethan asked, adjusting her pillows. "She needs a family, a real family." Ethan paused, looking at his wife. The old Ethan would have hesitated, weighed the risks, and found a dozen reasons to wait. But he wasn't that mad anymore. "Are you thinking about adopting her?" he asked. CLA nodded, watching him carefully. "I've always wanted to, even before the accident." "I know," he replied simply. And so began the journey that led them to this uncomfortable waiting room. They quickly discovered that the process wouldn't be easy. The rich and powerful could bypass many bureaucratic hurdles, but when it came to adoption, there were no shortcuts. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes?" A middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a clipboard stood at the doorway. "You can come in now." Ethan helped CLA to her feet. She still relied on a cane for support, but insisted on walking on her own whenever possible. Lily hopped off her chair and instinctively took CLA's free hand. The office of Miss Winters, the social worker, was as impersonal as the waiting area. Stacks of files, a dusty artificial plant, and an old computer filled the space. "Please have a seat," Miss Winters said, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. Once they settled, she opened a thick folder. "I've been reviewing your case. It's complicated." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Complicated how? Miss Winters adjusted her glasses. "To start with, Lily's legal status is unclear. She was abandoned as a baby, but there was never a formal relinquishment of parental rights. She was in the system until she ran away." "But that was months ago," CLA interrupted. "No one looked for her. No one cared that a 5-year-old girl was living on the streets." Miss Winters shifted uncomfortably. "Unfortunately, the system is overwhelmed. Yes, there are serious flaws, but right now, our focus is on determining what's best for Lily moving forward." Lily, sitting between Ethan and CLA, seemed to shrink with every word, as though bracing for disappointment. "What do we need to do?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite his frustration at how Lily's future was being treated like a bureaucratic problem. "There are forms to fill out, home assessments, background checks," Miss Winters listed, shuffling through her papers. "And, of course, we must consider special circumstances." "What special circumstances?" CLA asked, gripping Lily's hand a little tighter. Miss Winters hesitated. "Your medical condition, Mrs. Hayes. We need to ensure that prospective adoptive parents are fully capable of caring for a child." Ethan felt CLA stiffen beside him. "My wife is recovering exceptionally well," he said, his irritation slipping through. "And we're not alone. We have a strong support system." "I understand," Miss Winters replied, making notes. "But protocol requires a full medical evaluation." The conversation dragged on for nearly an hour. Questions about finances, education plans, work schedules, and family support filled the time. For every answer they provided, it felt like 10 more questions followed. By the time they left the building, CLA was exhausted, and Lily was unusually quiet. Their driver waited at the curb, holding an umbrella against the light drizzle. In the car, Lily pressed herself against the window, watching the blurred city lights through the rain. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" CLA asked, gently touching her shoulder. Lily didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't have to do this. I know it's hard." Ethan exchanged a pained glance with CLA. After everything, Lily still expected to be abandoned the moment things became difficult. "Look at me, Lily," Ethan said firmly, waiting until she turned to face him. "We're not doing this because it's easy. We're doing it because you are our family. And families face challenges together." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "But that lady doesn't think you should be my parents." "That lady doesn't decide our hearts," CLA said, her voice gentle but unwavering. When they got home, Lily rushed to her room. It wasn't just a guest room anymore. It was their project, a space they had decorated together. The walls were a bright, cheerful yellow, bookshelves were packed with toys and stories, and the ceiling was dotted with glow-in-the-dark stars. Clara glanced at Ethan, worry clear on her face. "This is going to be harder than we thought." Ethan wrapped his arms around her gently, mindful of her still fragile state. "We'll get through it," he assured her, "no matter how long it takes." Later that night, after helping Clara to bed, Ethan sat in his home office. Work was piling up, unanswered emails, decisions to finalize for the nearly completed community center. But he couldn't focus. The memory of Lily's face during the meeting earlier that day haunted him. The fear in her eyes, the silent belief that she would be rejected again. How could he prove to her that this time was different? That he wasn't the same man who once put business before relationships? That he no longer measured worth in profits, but in moments of real joy? His gaze drifted to a stack of boxes in the corner of the office, Clara's belongings from her personal office, untouched since the accident. A silent reminder of a life interrupted. On impulse, Ethan stood and opened the first box, hoping to find something, anything, that might reassure Lily. Most of the contents were documents, bank statements, notes from charity events, donation receipts. Clara had always been more meticulous than he was, attuned to the little details that truly mattered. But in the second box, his heart pounded as he pulled out a blue folder stamped with the Children's Services Department logo. With slightly trembling hands, he flipped it open. Inside were partially completed adoption forms, dated about a month before Clara's accident. She had already started the process. She had been thinking about adopting Lily long before her coma, long before Ethan even knew Lily existed. In the corner of one form, in Clara's graceful handwriting, was a simple note. "Talk to Ethan after visiting the orphanage. Show him, asterisk asterisk." A wave of emotion crashed over him. She had planned it all. On the day of the accident, she had likely been on her way to meet him, to finally introduce him to Lily, to share the dream she had kept to herself. As he sifted through the rest of the documents, more proof of Clara's intention surfaced, notes on legal procedures, newspaper clippings about adoption. even a pamphlet on helping children transition into a new family. Then, in a small envelope, he found photographs. Clara at the orphanage, surrounded by children. Pictures of Lily. And then one. Just the two of them, Clara and Lily, side by side, smiling, their faces glowing with happiness. On the back, in Clara's handwriting, were words that made Ethan's breath hitch. My daughter at heart. I just need to convince Ethan. He'll love her too. I'm sure of it, asterisk asterisk. A tear slipped down his cheek. Clara had believed in him, even when he had forgotten how to open his heart. Gathering the most important documents and photographs, he walked to Lily's room and knocked softly. May I come in? A quiet voice answered. Yes. Inside, Lily sat on her bed, hugging the teddy bear Clara had given her at the hospital. Her eyes were red, puffy from crying. Ethan sat beside her, placing the documents and photos in front of them. I found something I think you should see. Gently, he explained what he had discovered, that Clara had already started the adoption process, that she had always considered Lily part of their family. Lily's eyes widened as she looked at the photographs. She kept these pictures, and so much more. She had plans for you, Lily. Big plans. Lily ran her fingers over the inscription on the back of the photo, tracing the words, My daughter at heart. Her voice was small when she spoke. Why didn't she tell me? Ethan sighed. I think she wanted to be sure first. She wanted me to see the orphanage, to meet you myself. Claire always believed that some things had to be felt, not just explained. Lily nodded slowly, as if it was all beginning to make sense. What if we can't do it? What if that lady says no? Ethan took her hands in his and looked her in the eye. Lily, if there's one thing I've learned these past few months, it's that when you truly care about someone, you don't give up. Not at the first obstacle, not at the second, not even at the 100th. We'll face every hurdle, fill out every form, convince every social worker, because you are worth it. For the first time since the meeting, Lily smiled, a small, shy, but real smile. Can I show these photos to Mrs. Clare? She asked. Of course. First thing tomorrow. When Ethan finally left her room, Lily was already asleep, the photographs neatly arranged on her bedside table. He made his way to the bedroom he shared with Claire, surprised to find her awake, sitting up in bed with a book. I thought you were asleep, he said. I couldn't, Claire replied. I kept thinking about Lily, about that meeting. Ethan sat beside her and told her everything he had discovered. Claire listened in silence, her eyes gradually filling with tears. When he finished, she whispered, I had forgotten about those forms. So many memories are still hazy. You were going to take me to the orphanage that day, weren't you? Ethan asked softly. The day of the accident. Claire closed her eyes, concentrating. Yes, that was the plan. I had finally worked up the courage. I was so nervous. Ethan took her hands in his. I'm sorry you felt like you had to work up the courage to tell me. I'm sorry I was the kind of husband who made you hesitate to share something so important. Claire opened her eyes, her gaze soft yet steady. You're not that man anymore, Ethan. Don't blame yourself for the past. Look at what we're building now. They sat in silence, taking in everything they had lost, and everything they had found again. We're going to do it, aren't we? Claire asked finally, her voice filled with both hope and determination. We're really bringing Lily home for good? Ethan kissed her forehead. Yes, we are. Claire, when I think about how I almost lost you, how I found Lily by pure chance, I can't believe any of this is accidental. It has to mean something. It means family, Claire said simply. It means some bonds are too strong to be broken, even when they seem impossible. That night, Ethan slept with a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The challenges ahead were huge, relentless paperwork, biases to overcome, Lily's fears to soothe, but something stronger guided them now. The certainty that they were completing a journey Claire had started long ago. The certainty that they were already a family, whether or not an official document said so. That certainty was all the hope they needed. The morning light was exceptionally bright when Ethan woke up. Sunbeams peeked through the curtains, casting golden patterns across the bedroom floor. Next to him, Claire was still asleep, her face peaceful, free of the tension that had followed her through months of recovery. He allowed himself a moment to watch her, amazed at how far they had come. A sudden doorbell rang, breaking his thoughts. Ethan got up carefully so he wouldn't wake Claire and slipped on his robe. In the hallway, he saw Lily already awake, stepping out of her room. "Good morning," she said, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Who could it be so early?" "I don't know," Ethan replied, checking the time. "It wasn't even 8 a.m. Let's find out together." They walked to the front door. In the foyer, Ethan peeked through the peephole and saw a man in a suit holding an envelope. He opened the door cautiously. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," the man said formally. "I have a delivery for you requiring a signature." Ethan signed a receipt and took the sealed envelope. It was heavy, stamped with the letterhead of an international law firm he recognized immediately. "What is it?" Lily asked curiously as they stepped back inside. "Not sure yet," Ethan replied, examining the envelope. "Should we have breakfast first? Then I'll see what this is." In the kitchen, Ethan made coffee for himself and hot chocolate for Lily. Toast, eggs, and fruit completed the simple breakfast that had become their daily routine. As they ate, they talked about the day's plans. Lily had ballet class in the afternoon, and afterward, they would stop by the Claire Hayes Community Center, which was set to open in just 2 weeks. Claire joined them shortly after, walking without her cane, a recent milestone they celebrated quietly each morning. "Good morning, my loves," she said, bending down to kiss Lily on the forehead. Ethan barely registered the delivery man, leaving as he glanced out the window. When he turned back, an envelope sat on the counter. "He left this," Ethan said, motioning toward the package. "Aren't you going to open it?" Claire asked as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Ethan shrugged, trying to appear uninterested, but something about the envelope unsettled him. After breakfast, while Claire helped Lily get ready for school, Ethan finally retreated to his office and opened it. Inside was a formal letter and a thick contract. As he scanned the pages, his heartbeat quickened. It was a merger proposal. One of the world's largest financial corporations wanted to acquire his company for a sum that made his current fortune seem small in comparison. The letter outlined the terms. Besides a massive payout, they were offering him the role of global CEO in the newly merged entity. Years ago, this would have been his ultimate dream: power, prestige, unimaginable wealth. But there was a catch. He would have to move to London for at least 3 years to oversee the corporate transition. 3 years away from home, away from the community center that was just about to open, away from Claire, who was still recovering, away from Lily, who was finally beginning to feel secure in her new home. A few minutes later, Claire walked into the office and found him staring out the window, letter in hand. "Bad news?" she asked gently. Ethan turned to face her, his emotions written all over his face. "Not exactly. Professionally, it's incredible news." He handed her the letter. Claire read it carefully, her expression neutral, but Ethan noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. He knew her well enough to recognize it. "It's an amazing opportunity," she said finally, passing the letter back. "You should be proud. Your work is being recognized at the highest level." Ethan studied her face. "But," Claire sighed. "There is no but, Ethan. It's your decision. Your career has always been important to you." Something about how she said that made him uneasy. Despite everything they had been through, Claire still expected him to choose work over family. Maybe she was right to think that. Hadn't he done exactly that for years? "They gave me 2 weeks to decide," he said. "I have some time to think." Claire nodded and stepped forward, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "Lily's ready for school. I'll take her today, if that's okay. I need to stop by the doctor for my routine checkup anyway." "Sure," Ethan said distractedly. "I'll pick her up afterward and take her to ballet." Left alone, Ethan reread the proposal, trying to process the gravity of the offer. It wasn't just about money. It was the culmination of decades of hard work, the chance to lead one of the most influential financial institutions in the world. Opportunities like this didn't come around twice. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. The caller ID displayed the name, Victor Reynolds, the chairman of the corporation. Ethan answered. "Victor. Ethan, my friend." Victor's booming voice filled the line. I assume you received our proposal this morning? I did, Ethan said. Just finished reading it. It's quite the offer. Victor chuckled. Quite the offer is an understatement. This is the biggest deal we've ever put on the table. You've built something extraordinary, and we want you to lead our global expansion. The board is fully behind you. Ethan felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. I need time to think. I have personal commitments here. There was a brief pause on the other end. Yes, I heard about your wife's situation. An inspiring recovery story, from what I gather. And there's a child involved too, isn't there? Lily, Ethan corrected automatically. Her name is Lily, right? Victor continued unfazed. Look, Ethan, we understand your family situation. We're not insensitive to it. That's why we're offering the best schools in London for Lily, top-notch doctors for your wife, and a relocation package that includes a mansion in Kensington. They'd have every comfort imaginable. Ethan's eyes drifted to a framed photo on his desk, Claire, Lily, and him at the park, all smiling in a simple, everyday moment that had become incredibly precious. He took a deep breath. I'll think about it carefully, he said, keeping his tone neutral. You'll have my answer before the deadline. After hanging up, Ethan stood motionless for a long time. A year ago, he wouldn't have hesitated. He would have accepted immediately, assuming Claire would follow him, adapting her life to his career just as she always had. But now, everything was different. The next few days were a blur of emotions. He went about his usual routine, meetings about the community center, finalizing Lily's adoption paperwork, accompanying Claire to her medical visits. But the proposal lingered in the back of his mind like a storm cloud. At the office, Robert, his CFO and closest friend, couldn't understand his hesitation. Do you realize what's at stake? Robert asked, baffled. This is the big leagues, Ethan. The global recognition you've always worked for. I know exactly what's at stake, Ethan replied calmly. Then what's the problem? Claire and Lily can come with you. London's not exactly a hardship posting. Ethan turned to the window, looking out at the city he knew so well. The problem, Robert, is that it's not that simple. Robert scoffed. Since when does Ethan Hayes care about simple? You built an empire doing the impossible. This is just one more move. But Ethan knew it wasn't just another move. It meant uprooting Claire from her carefully built recovery, her doctors, her support system. It meant taking Lily away from her new school, where she was finally making friends and feeling safe. It meant leaving the community center unfinished, walking away before seeing it truly come to life. That night, when he got home, he found Claire and Lily in the living room, surrounded by colorful papers. What's this? He asked, setting his briefcase on the side table. We're making invitations for the community center's grand opening. Lily said excitedly, Look, this one's for Mrs. Martha. Ethan picked up the card, decorated with stars and hearts, feeling a lump in his throat. Lily's enthusiasm, Claire's careful folding of each invitation. How could he take them away from this? Later that night, after Lily was asleep, Ethan found Claire on the balcony, gazing at the city lights. Without a word, he sat beside her. You're thinking about the proposal, she said, not as a question, but as a statement. How do you know? She offered a small smile. I know that look. It's the same one you had when you were deciding whether to start your own company. Part determination, part fear. Ethan took her hand. Claire, what do you think about it? Honestly. She took a moment to consider. I think it's an incredible opportunity for you. The kind of recognition you've always deserved. But he pressed. She sighed, knowing there was more to say. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper as she admitted. I'm afraid. Afraid that London will turn into what your company was here, something that consumes you completely. Afraid that Lily, who's already lost so much, will lose the stability we've been building. And selfishly, afraid I'll lose this new version of you that I've rediscovered. Her honesty cut deep. She had put into words the fears that Ethan himself could barely acknowledge. I want you to know that whatever decision you make, I'll support you, she continued. I always knew who you were when I married you. Ambitious, driven, brilliant. I would never ask you to change that. But I have changed, Ethan said softly. Or at least I'm trying to. Claire smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, you have. Which is why I know you'll make the right choice, whatever it may be." The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise. He carefully slipped out of bed, so as not to wake Claire, and got dressed for a run, a habit he had picked up again during her recovery. Exercise helped clear his mind. The streets were nearly empty at that hour, with only a few early workers and the occasional fellow runner. At first, he jogged aimlessly, letting his feet move while his mind raced. Without realizing it, he ended up in front of St. Hope Orphanage. The old building still stood, a stark contrast to the nearly completed community center next door. He stopped, breathing heavily, taking it all in. This was where it had all started, where Claire had found purpose while he had built his wealth, where Lily had lost her first family, and, in a way, found her second. "I thought I'd find you here," a voice said behind him. Ethan turned, surprised to see Mrs. Martha approaching, leaning on her cane. "Mrs. Martha, what are you doing here so early?" The older woman smiled. "Old habits. I wake with the birds, always have. And I like watching the sunrise over the center. Feels like a miracle every morning." Ethan looked at the building again, trying to see it through her eyes. "Yes," he murmured. "I suppose it does." Mrs. Martha, always direct, got straight to the point. "I heard about the offer in London." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Claire told you." "Claire didn't have to. News like that travels fast in certain circles. And you, young man, are about to become a legend in the financial world, if you accept, of course." They began walking slowly, side by side, Mrs. Martha keeping pace with her cane. "It's hard to turn down," Ethan admitted eventually. "Of course it is," she agreed. "Offers like that are designed to be irresistible. That's how they get you." "Get me?" "Yes. They make you think you have no real choice, that you'd be crazy to say no. That's how they separate people from what really matters." Ethan considered her words. "A year ago, I would have said yes without hesitation." "You were a different man a year ago." He hesitated before voicing his deepest fear. "What if I'm throwing away the opportunity of a lifetime?" Mrs. Martha stopped and turned to face him. Her eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, were startlingly clear. "Ethan, you've already built a fortune that will last generations. You've achieved more than most men ever dream of. The question isn't whether you're throwing away an opportunity. The question is, what kind of opportunity matters most to you now?" They sat on a nearby bench, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. After a moment, Mrs. Martha continued. "Do you know what Claire told me when she started to recover? She said that during the coma, sometimes she could hear voices, faint, unclear words, but she recognized the emotions behind them. What brought her back, what made her fight, wasn't talk of medical treatments or business deals. It was the sound of you and Lily laughing together. It was the feeling of being loved, not for wealth or status, but for who she truly was." Her words struck Ethan deeply. He thought back to those afternoons in the hospital, how Lily would tell Claire stories, how he had learned to open up about his fears, his vulnerabilities, and his love. "I think I already know my answer," he murmured. Mrs. Martha smiled warmly. "I think you've known for a while, dear. You just needed time to accept it." The next afternoon, Ethan called a meeting with his board of directors. Seated around the long mahogany table in his office, the executives observed him with curiosity and unease. "I've received a merger proposal from Reynolds Global," he began, his tone direct. "It's an exceptional offer, including my relocation to London as global CEO." Murmurs of approval spread through the room. Robert, seated at the far end of the table, looked especially pleased. "After careful thought," Ethan continued, "I've decided to turn down the offer." A stunned silence fell over the room. "Turn it down," Robert repeated, incredulous. "Ethan, we're talking about billions, the most coveted position in the financial market." "I'm aware," Ethan replied calmly. "But my decision is final. Our company will remain independent, and we will implement the 5-year plan we discussed last month, focusing on socially responsible investments and expanding our charitable foundation." What followed were hours of heated arguments, desperate attempts to change his mind, and even veiled threats from certain board members. But Ethan stood firm. By the time the meeting ended, night had fallen. Exhausted but strangely at peace, he drove home. In the apartment, he found Claire and Lily in the kitchen, preparing dinner together. The sight of Claire carefully teaching Lily how to chop vegetables, both of them laughing at some private joke, confirmed what he already knew in his heart. "Papa!" Lily exclaimed, running into his arms the moment she saw him. The affectionate term, which she had only recently started using, still filled him with indescribable joy. "Hey, princess," he said, lifting her up. "I missed you today." Claire approached, placing a soft kiss on his cheek. "All okay?" she asked, noticing the tired lines on his face. "All great," he replied honestly. "Actually, I have news." They gathered around the kitchen table as Ethan shared his decision. Lily listened intently, though she didn't fully grasp its significance. Claire, however, understood completely. "Are you sure?" she asked, searching his face. "It's a huge sacrifice." Ethan shook his head. "It's not a sacrifice, Claire. It's a choice. The right choice. In fact, the only choice." Later that night, after dinner, after tucking Lily into bed, after settling into their now-treasured routines, Ethan and Claire sat on the balcony, just like the night before. But this time, the weight on his shoulders was gone. "You know what I realized today?" he asked, gazing at the stars above the illuminated city. "What?" she murmured. "I've spent half my life chasing a version of success measured by bank balances and resumes. And somewhere along the way, without even noticing, I found a different kind of success, one measured in smiles, in small moments of joy, in a sense of belonging." Claire rested her head on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. Not just for your decision, but for the man you've become, the man I always knew was beneath that ruthless executive facade." He smiled, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. "I had a good teacher." 2 weeks later, the Claire Hayes Community Center celebrated its grand opening under a clear blue sky, as if even nature was rejoicing in the moment. The spacious courtyard was decorated with colorful ribbons and balloons. Children of all ages ran excitedly through the playground, the library, and the tech-equipped classrooms. Parents and guardians mingled in small groups, some visibly moved by the opportunities now available to their children. At the center of the courtyard, a small platform had been set up. Ethan stepped onto it, followed by Claire, still walking with a slight limp, and Lily, dressed in her favorite blue dress for the special occasion. "Good morning, everyone," Ethan greeted, his voice amplified by the microphone. "Welcome to the official opening of the Claire Hayes Community Center." Enthusiastic applause echoed through the courtyard. "This center was born out of a promise," he continued. "A promise Claire made long ago, that no child should grow up without opportunities, without love, without hope. What you see today is just the beginning. We plan to replicate this model in other neighborhoods, other cities, creating a network of support for children and families in need of a second chance." Claire stepped forward, her recovery remarkable, though the doctors had warned that some aftereffects would remain. But in that moment, standing in the sunlight with Lily at her side, she radiated strength. "When I first started volunteering at the old orphanage," she said, gesturing toward the Victorian building next door, "I never imagined we'd reach this day. Every child I met taught me something about courage, resilience, and the incredible ability to find joy even in the hardest circumstances."